Call to order the special meeting of the Finance Committee of the City of Winston-Salem. Thank everybody for being here. The minutes would please reflect the committee is here in entirety, as well as the other 4 members of the City Council, so we welcome everybody here today. This is the kickoff meeting for our 22-23 fiscal year budget. City manager released it last Friday, I believe, and today is one of several meetings we will have, and I'll go over the schedule before we adjourn. With that, Mr. Garrity, I'll turn it over to you, and you can call on folks as you wish.
Thank you, Chairman Clark. Good evening. Good evening, Mayor Joines, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the Finance Committee and City Council. Good evening. This is our first time in 3 years to present the budget back in person. It is nice to present it in person to City Council as we go through this annual process. I do want to, before I make a few comments, I do want to thank Scott Tess and the members of his office. They have worked tirelessly on this budget. He will introduce them in a moment. Often during the last 30 to 60 days before the budget comes out, the manager will roam down to the budget office, and they're like, oh no, what is he changing today? So I tried not to change much this time, but their work and their ability to reflect and adapt to changes quickly is very appreciative. This is your most important policy tool. And what you do with the budget is the biggest statement you make as a government body. How you spend your budget, which is close to $500 million, is the biggest priority that you do. We have tried in this recommendation to align it closely with your strategic priorities, but we're just beginning that process now, review with you, and ultimately we will respond and adjust it as council wants to meet your strategic objectives. Look forward to working with each and all of you on that. Feel free to call us individually if you have individual questions as we move ahead. With that, I'll turn it over to Scott Tess.
So good afternoon, Chairman Clark, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the Finance Committee and Council. Good evening. As Mr. Garrity said, I would like to take just 1 second and recognize the budget staff that is back here. If they will stand and give a wave. These are the faces of the tireless folks who spent the nights and weekends creating the data, writing the highlights. So thank you very much to staff. As Mr. Garrity said, this is the fiscal year 23 budget. We have the meeting today and then another one here in about 48 hours. We will spend the majority of today discussing the operating budget, talking about the budget as a whole, moving into the general fund, looking at positions that have increased, looking at our basic revenue assumptions, and then also spending a little bit of time talking about the resident survey data that we've collected. Normally we would have somewhere around 30 to 40 slides on resident survey, but we've shortened it down here to be part of the budget presentation. So in terms of the total proposed budget for FY23 at $625.8 million, you can see there, and Sandy, do we have this one? There we go. As you can see, the $625.8 million total proposed budget.
Can you get that on our screens? Do y'all have it?
It's
They have it. So
it's
it's for
on
the
our-
public, but it's on our,
Okay, thank you.
thank you.
there we go.
Good, okay. And you can see the breakdown of operations, debt service, and capital there. We'll talk about the changes in the operating budget in terms of personnel and supplies and services. The increase in debt service there related to principal and interest payments on debt that's previously been authorized. And then obviously the large jump in capital is related mostly to the $55 million limited obligation bond package that we will substantially talk about on Thursday as part of the capital plan review. Looking at a very high level, we normally don't see a $93 million increase in the budget year to year, so it is very large in nature. Again, $55 million of that is a LOBS package you see there in terms of capital projects funds, a net $50 million increase. FY23 is not a 2/3 bond year, so that reflects the $55 million, but also a reduction in 2/3 bonds in an odd year. Have about $19 million worth of compensation changes in the annual budget across all funds. So we will discuss here today what that merit increase looks like, as well as some new public safety pay plans and the additional positions that are in the operating budget for FY23. Did want to remark there's a pretty substantial increase in acquisition of vehicles, most of it for replacement. We do have an aging fleet in the general fund, as well as in some of our utilities operations. So this budget tries to get us back on a little bit better footing with our vehicle and equipment replacement schedule. And then we discussed the $5.9 million being principal and interest payments for debt that's already been authorized. We'll note over there on the side, 35 net new positions, but 14 of those, and we'll talk about these again, are for transition to in-house recycling collection. And those positions will come on at different times during the year based on the training schedules for that program. At a very high level, the budget reflects by different focus areas and different service areas. We see environmental health at the top. That is a reflection of the city's water and sewer funds, as well as solid waste disposal and stormwater. The city's water and sewer fund is by far and away with its debt one of the largest, and that's why you see environmental health at the top. Public safety includes police, fire, and emergency management, and further on down the list. On the resources side, charges for services basically reflects that same thing. The water and sewer fund pays for all of its services via water and sewer fees, but we do see property taxes there being roughly a third of the total budget. Intergovernmental resources in terms of monies that we are receiving from the federal government and the state, sales taxes at roughly 10%. Bond proceeds, again, because we have the $55 million LOBS package, that would be different this year, and on further down the list for that total resources of $626 million. Looking at the property tax base, this is very similar to what we have shown in the trial balance budget, but a little bit higher in terms of the estimate that we got from the county tax office. So showing 1.6% growth in the total tax base here. Average non-reval growth is a little less than that, or excuse me, a little more than that at 2%, but 1.6% is a little bit above the last non-reval year, which was FY21 at 1.4%. So there are quite a few lines in this graph. This is a historical tax rate over time. What we will focus on here in terms of the proposed FY23 budget is a 2.36 cents per $100 of assessed valuation increase in the tax rate. Roughly 1.5 cents of that for compensation, including supporting the new public safety pay plans, and about 9/10 of a penny for the net new costs for recycling. The contract went up substantially, and this is also net of the additional revenues that we will be getting into the recycling program as well. The difference that you see here from what we showed in trial balance is that net new cost of the recycling program being in the tax rate as opposed to being in a fee separately. The management team reviewed this, and the city manager made the decision having this in the tax rate is a less regressive form of payment. When it comes to those who are at the lower end of the income spectrum, it is more likely that they would benefit from having this in the tax rate as opposed to a flat fee. We had also called it a user fee previously, and it's really more of an availability fee than a user fee. A lot of times when we talk about user fees, you have the opportunity to pay that or not. In this one, you would not have had the opportunity to choose whether or not to pay. So for those reasons, it's been included here in the tax rate instead of as a separate fee. You will have the option should you choose to look at it as a fee, but it has been included here for those reasons. We've talked about sales tax several times here since February. Would say generally we are still seeing sales tax growth that is kind of at an unexpected level. You can see there in Q1 and Q2 of this year, sales tax growth roughly 14% greater than the prior year. Did have a little bit of a dip in January that we were worried about, and then the February report came in at almost 19% growth. The sales tax numbers are, when we say February, that's February sales, so we're about 3 months behind, so we don't know what the last 3 months has really looked like. We'll continue to bring those numbers to City Council. We do have a projected 5% growth through year end, and then 3% for the following year. I will say that is pretty conservative based on obviously what we're seeing currently. don't know what's going to happen in the market, don't have that crystal ball available to us, and this is one of the places where we're being a little more conservative in the budget, where we have been slightly more aggressive in some of the other revenue areas, particularly related to construction permits and even in that recycling commodity revenue as part of the net change in the contract.
Mr. Tesh?
Yes, ma'am.
A quick question. I have, my understanding is that sales tax in FY '20, perhaps '21, a lot of that was due to the stimulus checks that people received. Do we know how much of the current increase is because of the cost of goods themselves going up?
So we don't get reports from the state that would break down that kind of thing. There are specific commodity types for sales, taxable retail sales that we could look at. I think one of the issues with this being February, the most recent month we have, is this is about the time with the next distribution in March where fuel really started to skyrocket. And so there are some questions about would the displacement of your discretionary income come along with those increase in fuel prices by 20 or 30%. So we can get you some additional information on kind of those individual commodity types, but really don't have a great handle on how much of the prior growth was related to those stimulus payments and how much of it now is just the economy seems to be better and have a higher level of inflation.
Thank you.
So that at a high level is kind of where we're at on expenditures and revenues. I am going to take just a second here and turn the microphone over to Dr. Marcus Barnett, the city's Human Resources Director, and he is going to talk about employee compensation across all funds.
Good evening, Mayor Joines, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the committee, and members of the council. Hope you all are well. So I'm here this evening to discuss the merit adjustments and other adjustments in compensation for City of Winston-Salem employees. So the budget includes an average of about a 3.8% merit increase for city employees. As you all know, we do this on a step plan. So for employees that are at meets expectations, they'll receive a 3% adjustment, exceeds expectations at 3.5%, and outstanding at 4.5%. So we've budgeted based off of the way that our numbers were for last year that will probably be somewhere around a general about 3.8% for all employees. This will be effective in the first pay cycle beginning in October, so the first pay period beginning after October 1st, and it'll be based on people's merit for their performance evaluations. The performance evaluation period will be for essentially through July 1 of this year. The other thing that you all will see in the budget this year is that we're creating two career ladders. So just like the one that we brought before you all, I think last year, I believe it was, for the Planning and Development Services Department and their inspections division, this is for public safety. So in police and in fire. So in police, what you'll see, we are creating the police officer 2 and the master police officer classification. In so doing, we're going to create a 5% buffer between the time that an officer becomes, so when they get hired as a trainee, they'll get a 5% increase at the point that they pass BLET and become a police officer. Given 3 years in that classification, they're then eligible to promote up to a police officer 2. That'll come with a 5%. They can then, after 3 years in that classification, promote up to a master police officer for another 5%. After that, we go into the corporal, and that's where it starts to be the regular competitive promotional process. This was really in conjunction with looking at what other municipalities were doing for their officers and an opportunity for us to remain competitive with what our competitors are doing across the state and the nation. We also looked at doing the same thing in the fire department. So creating that firefighter 2 and the master firefighter, providing a 3% promotion at each of those levels. And then all of those other employees, much like in the police department, where their employees will get about a 10% adjustment for compression. In fire department, they'll see about a 6% compression adjustment.
Mr. Barnett,
Yes, ma'am.
could you explain in brief why the compressions what's the differences in the two departments? They both provide public safety, but I understand perception would be that police work in a more dangerous environment, especially the climate we live in right now. But I think if can't do it today, you need to provide a talk sheet that breaks down why we're doing it this way.
Okay.
And again, I hope and also see the comparison again of what other cities are doing in North Carolina, because I would hate for us to even do this and we lose because we're still at the bottom of the other communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this just gives kind of a little bit more information, much like what I was just mentioning, just again, oversight of where it goes. And then the evaluation and promotions are done biannually for the police officer to a master police officer. The biggest concern here is that this does not exempt our public safety employees from receiving performance evaluations, because at the point that they get to that master police officer and they're attempting to participate in that competitive promotional process, they still will be really paying very close attention to how they have performed in their time with the department. But again, they're no longer subject to the merit provision. So instead of them receiving, that between 3 and 4.5%, they'll be receiving what comes along with them moving up that career ladder. And again, this replaces the public safety step plan. So the adjustments that have typically been coming that you all see that happen in July and one happens in January, those will go away in lieu of this new program that we're proposing if it goes through the budget. And then all other positions in the police and fire departments will continue to be subject to the provisions of the merit increases that are approved by this council annually. So the estimated increases for our salary for police and fire, we're looking right now and I won't read this off to you, but this is how we've done it. We've based it on the number of years of experience they have as a police officer or as a firefighter. So these will be changes that we're making to keep up with compression and make sure that we don't have any of those ongoing issues.
Mr. Barnett, Dr. Barnett?
Yes, ma'am.
I know all of this is to help us retain officers as well as to recruit them. After a certain period of years, I guess police officer, then you go corporal through captain for the police department, and then engineer through battalion chief for the fire department. Do we see any other levels between those that would encourage retention if people can get promoted up to another level between corporal, captain, engineer, battalion chief? That would make sense.
So as we look at our peers, this is kind of the standard model that most of them are doing. They really focus mostly on the police officer, those firefighter positions. They're not as, I'll say, concerned with the higher level positions. The prevailing standard at this point is that once they get to kind of that level, that they then go into that competitive process and they start to focus a little bit more on what that person was able to bring to the department, how they were able to perform, what their metrics were in terms of them being able for promotions.
And then how do we address a police officer who loves being just the police officer, who's been there for many years, and the firefighter who loves just being the firefighter, who's been there for many years, but they get a significant pay increase for just staying with us? How do we make sure that we're compensating them adequately?
So we encourage them. So once, if someone, let's say, they get here and they get outside of, where is it? There it is. Yeah, so let's say somebody gets to, say, that police officer position and they get to their 6 years of service and they've decided they don't want to go up to master police officer, or let's say they do go up to master police officer and that is where they want to stay. Once they get to a certain level of compensation, they will then switch over, for lack of better terminology, onto the merit schedule. And so then they will start being considered for those annual merit adjustments as the council does each year.
And I think that strategy, though, has led to some kind of compression within the pay scale
So not in, because it's not the strategy that we employ right now. In talking to our peers around this area, some of them have seen that happen sometimes, but it doesn't happen that often.
Dr. Burnett, are we seeing any effects as far as recruitment on the firefighter side because of our current pay schedules?
Yes and no. So I will say we are receiving fewer applicants than we have in the past, but I would leave that to the chief to talk about the applicants that are actually going through the process, just because my department doesn't necessarily handle all of those pieces.
The chief will speak to that.
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I was doing email. Yeah, Chief, come on up.
Let's do it, email.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the committee and council. Now I'm ready, sir. Would you
Hey,
please
Chief.
state your question?
I was curious if we were seeing any impacts on hiring in your department based on our on what we pay.
Our application rate has been down about 10% year over year for the last 5 or 6 years. The last hiring process we ran, the applications were down 35%. But I nor any of our peers, and I talked to a lot of fire chiefs, I've just come back from the Metro Chiefs Conference, everybody is seeing the same thing, but nobody can really put their finger on even 2 or 3 things as to why it's happening. It seems to be a combination of things, but to say it's just salary, or it's just this group coming into the workforce, or it's just something else, nobody will really put their finger on a single item or 2.
Definitely something to keep an eye on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Dr. Barnett, if you'll continue, please.
And that concludes my dog and pony show. Oh, that's all you. That's yours.
Thank you, Marcus. Moving on from compensation generally, we're going to talk about the general fund in a little more detail. So at a high level, the general fund is up almost 12% year to year. We see that 7.6% increase in property taxes, again, mostly reflective of the 2.36 cent increase in the rate. Sales taxes, again, year to year, significantly higher based on the growth mostly that we're seeing in the current year and some conservative projections for next year. Fund balance is up year to year. As we talk about capital, you'll see several $1 million worth of general fund balance being used for capital projects for deferred maintenance, as well as a little bit of it being used to help offset some of the one-time or startup costs of the in-house recycling collection program. Moving down to the personnel side, we're going to talk about each one of these expenditure categories in a little more detail, but a roughly 9% increase in personnel, reflective of what Dr. Barnett just talked about, as well as the increase in positions. Supplies and services costs we'll get into as well. Some of that very similar to what you've seen in the trial balance budget presentation. Lease payments, again, we will talk about vehicle acquisition and show a little information there by department. And then on the transfer side, where you saw an appropriation of fund balance, and we talked about using it for capital projects, that's the transfer from the general fund mostly to a capital projects fund in terms of the increase. So again, looking at compensation, salary, wages, and benefits up 9.7%. And then we are, as we've shown before as well, using about $1 million extra in a salary savings adjustment for next year. So we have seen higher levels of attrition than we are used to seeing and are currently roughly in that 19% range in terms of vacancy. So this is a number we feel comfortable with, that based on the current level of attrition and where we expect it to be next year, that we'll have an additional $1 million in salary savings on top of the current or on top of what's budgeted. So the total there at 9.2%, again, it includes that average merit that Dr. Barnett talked about. There are required increases from the state for pension-related benefits. Those are in the budget as well. It includes those fire and police pay plans in the general fund that he was talking about. It funds the new positions steps, as well as the 2% adjustments each year, or 4% total, 2 in the beginning of the fiscal year and then 2 in January. We'll talk about the new positions, which are in the city manager's message. And also a note there that we did remove the flat rate pay plan here just a month or 2 ago, and so that had some pretty significant effects, particularly on our recreation department with all of the seasonal employees that they have in aquatics, as well as some of the summer youth recreation programs and summer camps. So in terms of new positions, this is very similar to what we saw in trial balanced budget. We have several positions in community development that are related to housing and neighborhood services, as well as homelessness prevention. We have a couple of positions there in community development as well that are the rapid response crew that we talked about for abatement services, that being the senior equipment operator and 2 vehicle operators. The positions in vegetation management and recreation and parks are related to new recreation and parks amenities that have come online and need to be maintained. The human relations DEI position for a language access coordinator for outreach to our Spanish-speaking populations. 2 trades inspectors in planning and development services to keep up with workload and get rid of some of the backlog. And then 2 new positions here in the fire department in administration that you didn't see in trial balanced budget. Had a determination that there are some needs administratively in the fire department, both in terms of managing human resources as well as additional resources for training. And so you see those positions reflected there. I would draw your attention to the right, and again, 14 new positions for that transition to in-house recycling, 13 of them being equipment operators and an additional supervisor position. There is already 1 supervisor position in that recycling program, so we'll have 2 total supervisors directly over the collections program.
Scott, do you expect those 14 hires in recycling, how will they be phased in?
So the 1 supervisor is expected to come online in November, and the equipment operators are expected to come online in January, giving them roughly 3 months to get up to speed, learn the routes, so that we would effectively take over that contract on April 1st of 2023.
So we have them budgeted in for half a year?
We have the supervisor budgeted for 7 months, or 7 or 8 months, and then the other positions budgeted for 6, yes.
Thank you.
I would point out, those are not necessarily going to cost the city anything because we're not going to be paying Waste Management to man the trucks. We'll be manning our trucks going forward. I will say, and I won't comment any further on that, I'm having major indigestion with adding that many people in community development. We don't own apartments. And it looks like to me we're hiring managers to manage the managers of the housing authority who runs the apartments. So I got issues there, but we'll worry about that later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later.
Okay. Thank you. Please continue.
Mr. Chairman,
Oh, yeah, excuse me, Mr.
having
John had
sat
a
through an
question.
hour and a half of homelessness briefings today, could you please just elaborate for me the continuum care coordinator position, which is a topic that came up in that meeting today as to how we're dealing with homelessness?
Councilmember Larson, that is one I'll have to get back to you on with the specific details on it. I know at
I know
a
it's pretty
generally
deep.
high level what it's for, but
I know
if you
it's
spent an
kinda
hour and a
deep in
half
the
talking
weeds.
about it today, you're probably as in the weeds or more so than I am, but we can get you a good write-up on
I
it.
understand. It came up today, and I'm just curious about it. I see we're plugging a hole, I guess.
Again, I'll get the details back to you on it.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Let me say, because we've got a lot to cover, and I got a lot of individual questions, but I think we can all either email or call Mr. Tesh with them. And what they typically do is they have a addendum that they put together that has all the questions and answers because they could be all over the place.
We will have a response packet from the questions that come today and on Thursday, and we'll get it to you in the middle of next week, hopefully before next Thursday's meeting.
And I'll call you with mine later.
Sounds good?
Thank you.
Moving on to the non-personnel categories in the general fund, so supplies and services up roughly 12%. We'll talk about that on the next slide. Did want to touch on the equipment lease payments being up just over 50%. You see there by department, represents roughly $17 million worth of vehicle acquisition and replacement in the general fund. A vast majority of that being in sanitation. So we have some older side-loading sanitation trucks and refutes that need to be replaced, as well as doing some wholesale replacement in our curbside collection program, specifically trying to make sure that we get all the old leaf loaders and such, provide the resources for it, so hopefully we get them in as quickly as possible. The way the markets are with purchasing vehicles and equipment right now, don't want to make any promises about how quickly those will come in, but at least make the resources available for those programs for replacement. The fire department includes 2 pumpers and a ladder truck. In police, we have some police pursuit vehicles as well as unmarked cars. Down in traffic field operations in DOT, again, equipment replacements related to everything that we do out in the field from a transportation perspective. And in recreation and parks, a good portion of that is actually out at Winston Lake Golf Courses. We have some aging equipment that is in need of replacement there as well. Bottom bullet there, we have also included $840,000 worth of lease payments. It's a little over $4 million in acquisition costs for those vehicles for the transition to the in-house recycling program. You approved that a few months ago, I think, but those are absolutely included in the budget for recycling. Again, this is going to be kind of similar to what you've seen at trial balance budget. One of the largest cost increases is that recycling contract itself. We have $1 million worth of additional cost for fuel programmed in '23. I am not sure that that's necessarily going to be enough if fuel prices stay where they are right now. So we'll talk about fund balance here in a bit and how we might want to kind of keep some of that as a hedge against inflation. Sanitation tipping fees we've talked about several times. The tonnage is up, as well as utilities has raised their rates just a little bit. City building security in terms of metal detection services for Bryce A. Stewart and City Hall is in the budget. Some increases for IS charges. That fire dispatch services agreement went through Public Safety Committee last month. General operating supplies, and you see over there the bullet point, some of that is related to fire turnout gear, as well as replacing most of, if not all of, the automated external defibrillators on fire trucks. And then did want to note here, roughly a 50% increase in travel and training budgets and professional development budgets in the general fund. Don't think we've had a wholesale increase there in well more than a decade, and I do believe the last time we did it was actually a 25% decrease during the Great Recession. So trying to catch up with our peers in some form or fashion on providing opportunities for our employees to develop and train. So that's the end of the general fund summary. We're going to move into the end of year projection. I'm going to talk about the first slide, and then I'm going to invite Lisa Saunders up to talk about a policy change that she and the city manager are recommending. So we are talking about adding $20 million to general fund balance at the end of fiscal year 22 here in June. First thing I will say, that is a projection. We have no idea what that's going to be until October when the audited financial statements get completed. So this is just kind of our snapshot picture of what we think could happen. Starting at the bottom and kind of going up, looking at the difference year to year, we have the amount that's restricted by state statute simply staying the same. We don't know what will happen there. The difference between the $31.2 million and $39.9 in reserve per policy, as you see and was in the city manager's message, is a recommendation to move from 14% to 16% of budgeted general fund expenditures. And again, Lisa's going to talk about that. That light blue aqua category at $5.3 million is what's reserved for the ARPA framework, but we brought over to the general fund. So staff is still going to continue to talk about that in terms of the ARPA framework or transformational framework. It just happens to be parked in the general fund right now. $5 million, again, roughly, that we're appropriating next year for one-time needs, and that leaves about $4.5 million at the top in undesignated fund balance. That, again, would be great to have in the piggy bank, the way inflation is going up with fuel prices, with lots of capital projects coming in significantly over budget in terms of the scoping that we're having to do with them. It would be great to have as much of that in reserves as you could have for those future needs as they pop up. So I am going to turn it over to Lisa Saunders, our Chief Financial Officer, and let her walk through a few slides on this change in fund balance policy.
Good evening, Chairman Clark, Mayor Joins, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, and members of City Council. As you can see above, staff is recommending a fund balance policy change recommendation, and this is for general fund. Currently, the city's fund balance policy is 14% of our unassigned fund balance as a percentage of subsequent year budget. So that's what we have set aside for next year's budget. It's currently 14%. Over the last several years, we've moved it from 10% to 12.5% to 14%, and now we'd like to move it up to 16%, especially in a year that we're adding so much money to our fund balance. We may not be here again for a very long time. As we've talked about before, our Government Finance Officers Association, they recommend 2 months of expenditures to be set aside as unassigned fund balance, and that calculates out to be 16.7%, which is a best practice. Next is just a slide that it's just a comparison to let you know, one, what other municipalities and counties policy is, and 2, the second column is actually where we ended up at the end of the year. All of these municipalities, except for Mecklenburg and Wake, they have just a little bit different policy. They're all unassigned as a percentage of subsequent year budget. You can see the lowest being Greensboro has a 9% policy, and they came in at 9.9 at the end of the year, and then down to Charlotte and Durham being 16 and 16.7 as their fund balance, and Durham being the highest at 27%, and then Raleigh coming in next at almost 19%. County government is just a little bit different, so I think the better comparison is probably just looking at municipalities, but this is what everyone else's fund balance is in the other large cities and counties. The next slide is a new financial performance indicator that the Local Government Commission is looking at. On an annual basis, we as municipalities are required to submit financial data when our financial reports are complete. And they've been reviewing lots of information for years, but they've never really communicated what those numbers are. So now when we send our information every year, there's basically many different indicators, but you either get in the green, the yellow, or the red area. One of those areas is they want us to have 25% minimum of an unassigned and assigned fund balance in general and debt service funds. And you can see we're the third down. We ended up the year at about 38%, which we're over the minimum. Greensboro was actually under the minimum at 21.96. What happens when you're under a minimum? The LGC is going to want to come back to council, or me to come back to council, and make a plan on how we're going to get to what they require as the minimum. Again, we're at 38.43, but you got to remember that that includes our debt service fund. We front end the debt service fund when we had the 2014 and the 2018 bond referendum, so we have lots of cash there to pay our debt service over the next 20 years. So I think we just need to be mindful that that's not excess, that's just there available to pay our debt service. Raleigh was interesting. I kind of did a little more digging in that because I thought you might want to be interested to know. They actually assign in their fund balance monies for capital projects, for community development, other things. So they kind of have different savings accounts within their general fund. So that looks just a little bit out of normal, I would say, to the rest of them. And you can see the counties below them. So again, staff does recommend that we change our fund balance policy to 16%. And I will turn it back over to Scott unless there's questions.
Thank you, Ms. Saunders.
Finish up the budget portion as we're looking at comparison data. One thing that we always try to show here is a comparison of city taxes and fees amongst the 5 largest cities in North Carolina. So what we've done here is taken the property taxes. I will say this year we had to find a little bit of a different data set, so we're using median county home value here. The last ACS, or American Community Survey data, was 2019, and with housing prices where they are, that just didn't seem like the right number to use. There are some other MSA or statistical area data where it grabs things outside the county or even for Charlotte outside the state. So this is using a county home value, but it's a pretty good number. So as you can see, we're at the bottom. I would say that the biggest thing that we see as a change year to year in this is actually that Greensboro is significantly closer to the top than what they normally are. It is a revaluation year for Guilford County, and they proposed what they called rate neutral, which is an effective 11.7 cent tax rate increase in the city of Greensboro. So we are further away from that local peer on this chart than we have been in prior years as a result of that. But you see the somewhat lower use of taxes in Raleigh and Charlotte, and they kind of offset those with fees that we don't necessarily charge as well. So still at the bottom here. Moving on, I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about resident survey data and how it relates to what's in the budget. Again, we would normally do a little bit longer presentation, but tried to shorten this down. Generally, why do we do these resident surveys? The statistical significance of the survey allows us to make a generalization about the overall population. We do get a really good sample size, which we'll talk about here, but it gives us a margin of error of roughly 4%, which is pretty good in terms of resident surveys of this size. And we do get from the vendor benchmarking in terms of both regional and national cities. So in terms of the number that we get a minimum of 100 responses per ward, a minimum of 1,000 overall. You can see in Raleigh, Charlotte, and Durham how many responses per 1,000 residents they're getting versus what we're getting. We did see a drop-off here recently. I think, I'm just going to kind of opine on this one, that when COVID hit, there were a lot of folks at home checking their mail every day, and so we got a few more responses during the pandemic than we get now. But we do also, in addition to having the randomly selected survey population, we do also have the ability for anyone who wants to take it online as well. Going to talk here a little bit about respondents and go through that. So a really pretty good breakdown of Caucasian, African American, and other compared to what the city's demography looks like. About 50-50 split on male and female. In terms of rent or own, we are, and most cities are not, usually able to get the number of respondents in the rental category reflective of their overall city, but this is a little bit better than we've done in prior years, so it's good in terms of home ownership versus rental. In terms of annual household income, you'll see there roughly 44% of respondents were under $60,000, which is approaching median household income in Forsyth County. So we do have a good span here of different income types as well. I'm sorry if this is a little small, but at a very high level, the city rated better in 34 of 57 categories when compared to the U.S. average. As a place to live, 35% above the U.S. average. So overall, when we do these resident surveys, we come out and compare pretty well at a high level to most of the folks in our comparison groups nationally and regionally. We tend to spend more time talking about what we don't do well, and so the next couple of bullet points and slides, we're going to do a little more focus on what are the residents maybe not as happy with or where their perception's headed. Overall here with these bullet points, you can see 2 related to police visibility and crime. The ones that are related to public transit is its own section, and so the methodology always spits out a public transit top priority, but that's more related to how we ask the questions. Maintenance of streets and sidewalks, we will talk specifically about this one on either the next slide or the slide after. Do have some items on there related to litter pickup, several community development-wise in terms of code enforcement, demolishing vacant structures and housing rehab programs, and do also want to point out down there condition and cleanliness of catch basins and the maintenance of city parks. The budget does include in many of these areas appropriations, at least to get us back to a baseline of service or to increase some of these. So at a very high level, again, our eyes usually tend to draw right down to the bottom. We have seen every year that we've done this survey, maintenance of city streets and sidewalks at the bottom, dissatisfied, nearly half of the city being dissatisfied with the condition of our maintenance and sidewalks. Going up from there, we also see the city stormwater system. Again, in that same area near the bottom. We do normally see police and fire services and water services, solid waste close to the top as well. So the next couple of slides, a blue arrow pointing up means we're generally doing well. The red arrow pointing down means maybe not quite doing so well. And I'm sorry, it may be difficult to see the yellow line or the yellow bar is the U.S. average and the red bar is the Atlantic average. The one I would draw your attention to, again, the overall feeling of safety in the city, significantly below our peers in terms of the perception of safety in the city. And I think what's most interesting to that as we move to the next slide is that our police services are actually ranked higher than those comparison groups. So it's not necessarily that folks think the police department is doing a bad job or that they have issues with the police department, more so just the overall perception of safety within the city. Again, I'll draw your attention down there towards the bottom. City stormwater management, significantly behind the Atlantic average and a little below the U.S. average. And maintenance of city streets and sidewalks, I really want to talk about that one. Generally, city streets and sidewalks are the worst in every city. We saw this year we're a little bit further behind than we normally are. So not only is it one of those things that residents are telling us that's at the bottom of the list in terms of perception, we also got a little more variation from the group in a downward trend. We do have, as we'll talk about in the capital plan on Thursday, additional funding for street resurfacing. Looking at community services right there, we talked about new positions in community development. And in terms of the city stormwater management system, you'll see in the capital plan additional funding for capital projects in stormwater. So the FY23 proposed budget does include money to take care of some of these issues that we see closer to the bottom. Did want to note here in terms of solid waste services as we break down, doing a little bit better on a lot of those services other than leaf collection. I think we did have some issues with leaf collection, but again, this is an area where we have gone into the curbside collection program and essentially in the proposed budget replaced every single thing we could in curbside collection to get this service back up. At a high level, conclusions again, the city is rated very highly compared to the Atlantic region as well as compared to our U.S. counterparts. Would keep in mind down there at the bottom those top maintenance priorities, maintenance of city streets. There are funds in the budget for that. Crime prevention and public visibility. There was funding in last year's budget, and there are conversations about this as well. And there are increases in the police pay plan to help with retention. There's money for community development, specifically when it comes to cleanup of trash and debris on private property in this budget. There in the capital budget is a $1.6 million set aside for downtown parking and a significant amount of parks maintenance in the budget. So many of the things that residents identified as their top priorities for the coming years are addressed in the FY23 budget. We'll stop here and talk about the review calendar. After today's meeting, we have, again, a meeting focused almost exclusively on capital in terms of that $55 million LOBS package, as well as the rest of the normal capital plan. We have the public hearing that Thursday evening, an additional workshop next week where we will provide that response packet in advance of and take any changes to the budget and potentially looking at consideration of the recommended budget and property tax rate. And then the budget will be up for adoption with an additional public hearing on Tuesday, June 21st, not being on a Monday because of the Juneteenth holiday. So that is all that I have for you today. More than happy to take any high-level questions or, as Chairman Clark said, to take those emails and calls as well. I'll just
Start here. Ms. Adams had her hand up for a while.
Thank you so much, you and your staff, for everything that you do in an attempt to help all of us understand data and money and financials the way you do. I just think that I have asked the city manager, I'm sure you've heard, Mr. Tesh, that when Greensboro did what they did, it sent everybody all over the state like, how can they do this? How did they do this? And I've asked the city manager to ask your department to put together a matrix that shows the what, the why, the how. How did they and voted on it. I think, have they voted on it, Mr. Garrity? But they're gonna vote on it because they realize that they are now a player in the game in the triad. And in order to be in the game, you got to put skin in the game. And that means improving the quality of life of your city, your residents, police, fire, transportation, streets, schools, everything. So I would like to see a side-by-side of what Greensboro did because, again, that slide that you all show us every year since I've been here, I think this is my 12th budget. And we are the lowest paying city of our other cities. I will continue to stomp on that. That is nothing to be proud of in the world we live in right now, with our community and citizens needing more, and there are more that need more than others. And I think Winston-Salem needs to get off the can and do something. If we want to pay people, if we want our communities to look better, if we want to put the time and money into programs, and I know we got ARPA, and I know we got Community Development Block Grant, but we still are a growing city. We are over 252,000 people. So again, my question is bring to the council, get it to them Thursday, and show them the why of what Greensboro did and why we continue to be happy and satisfied with being in last place in trying to make our community and our citizens have a better quality of life. Other than that, I've reviewed it, Mr. Tesh. I'll review it again and make my highlights and send my questions to you, the city manager, and your staff. Again, thank you.
Ms. Burke.
Thank you, Chair Clark. Mr. Tesh, this was a lot of information, good information, and I do appreciate you and your staff. I just have some questions. And this is my second budget review, so I apologize if I'm asking some questions that everybody else has the answer to. It looks like the ETC Institute conducted this survey, and is that who we have used in the past?
Yes, ma'am. It's the vendor that we've used for the last 4 or 5 years. We put that out for RFP in the 2018 timeline, and again, here for 22, they were reselected.
Thank you. And I know that we have over 250,000 citizens, and I'm just concerned that the sample of residents surveyed is only 1,000. And I know we have representation, 100 from each ward, but I would love to see a more detailed breakdown of maybe the residents that participated by zip code, and even annual household income. We have that on the screen, but I don't know where these residents live. I don't know where they're located. And, this is very important information because it will determine where we spend our money going forward. So for my other questions and recommendations, I'll email. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Mundy.
I'll echo everyone's thanks because I know how much work it takes to put together a budget. I've never put together one this big, but I know it takes a lot of time and effort. I don't think I see our comparison year over year, the satisfaction survey. Can we get that? So, how we rated 89%. I see the comparison to the Atlantic region and to the U.S., but I would like to see just Winston-Salem satisfaction rates year over year.
Absolutely. We'll provide that to you, Councilmember Mundy. We'll get you the full report as well. It's about 400 pages long. I was trying to spare you some of those intricate details in the presentation, but absolutely we'll compile that and do the cross tabulations, Councilmember Burke, that you've asked for by location and income level.
Thank you very much.
Ms. McIntosh, you have something? Anything over here? Yes, sir. Okay, so Mr. Tesh is in the phone book. Please give me a detailed question. Ms. Adams, I must respond to your comment. I'm a bit puzzled because we had an 11% tax increase last year. Doing our revaluation, we went down a half a penny or something, but anyway, just because I voted against it. Anyway.
I know.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We will again call you. We will meet again Thursday at 5 o'clock. And then what's at 7? Is that a public comment period?
The Finance Committee public hearing on the budget.
Okay, so at 7 o'clock, we'll have the general public if they have any comments they want to make on the budget. So with that, I want to thank all the staff for being here. I see a lot of our managers here. Thank you for being here today. And guys, we'll get going on it because in June the 25th, we're going to do something. Okay? That's when we got to approve something. Thank you very much. We are adjourned.
Thank you.